right. I see it is about a minute past 10 a.m. I know Sam is still letting people in. Well, let's go ahead and get this kicked off. So welcome to the California School Facilities Research Institute Symposium. My name is Julie Arthur, and I'm the chair for the Coalition for Adequate School Housing. I'm also the executive director of Facilities and Planning for Palm Springs Unified School District. And with me on the screen this morning is Jeff Becker. Jeff is the Senior Director of Facilities for the Office of Fresno County Superintendent of Schools. And we're also going to have Don Ulrich join us in a minute, who's a retired Deputy Superintendent of Clovis Unified School District. I should never forget that. the perfect district, as I'm told. For those of you not familiar with CASH, in a nutshell, CASH was founded in 1978 to advocate for K-12 school facilities funding and improved facilities in California. CASH is an organization of more than 1,000 public and private sector members, making it the largest statewide premier organization focused exclusively on school facility issues. Since 1982, with the support of CASH, 16 statewide school bonds have been placed on the ballot for a total of $61 billion approved for school facility funding. Next slide, Sam. So with that, let's do a little housekeeping. During the presentation, all attendees will be placed on mute. We encourage you to use the chat feature throughout the session to interact with presenters and each other. If you have questions that the whole group could benefit from hearing, please enter them in the chat box so we can address them at the end or actually during the presentation if the speaker is able to. You just move your cursor at the bottom and that's where your chat box is if you're not familiar with it. Let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about California School Facility Research. We have the founding member with us this morning, which is Don Ulrich, Superintendent School for Clovis Unified School District. But I also wanted to recognize our CSFR founding members and donors in 2018. And our first one is Jean and April Hartline. Jean was the first CASH chair and April Deputy Superintendent of Orange County Schools. We also have Bruce Kearns from Stifel and Nicholas. We have John Smith from SIM PBK Architects. We have Robert Thornton, Teeter Architects. We've got Rick Davey with Davey Architecture, Mike Hennessy, Garden Architecture, and Jim DiCamillo with PBK WLC Architects. So with that, head and next slide. And Don, welcome.
Thank you, Julie. Good morning, everyone. I guess you want me to jump right in, Julie?
Be great.
All right. Well, I want to start off and with some context here, just briefly to talk about CSFRI, and the slide says response, but really I want to, before I do that, a response to what, right? Share that context of what we were responding to when we came up with this idea of the California School Research Institute. And basically, I was the chair of CASH in the 2016 timeframe. And that's when, if you remember, CASH supported a state bond measure, as we normally do. And we had to go the initiative route, which was difficult and challenging and somewhat risky, but we did it for the good of our kids and teachers in California. And a bond measure was passed through the initiative level. And I think to further this story, you got to remember that, public education, at least probably just about everybody on this Zoom today's mind, is critical, right, to the democratic process we have in our nation and in our state. And you got to start with that, because what happened, and you got to start with the fact that the Constitution of California says that the state of California will fund revenue for the operations and the work of public education, which means facilities too. And so when you go back to that 16 timeframe, we passed a bond measure. And then when I was chair, we had this stumbling block. And really it was the governor of California, that at that time directed the Department of Finance to sell the bonds that we had been authorized to sell when we had needed projects, and projects that were waiting and needed by our communities. And that's what happened that formed the response, if you will, that at that time, as a former public educator, I spent a lot of time as a teacher and a school site leader, ended up as a high school principal. And I knew in my gut the effect great facilities, quality facilities have on children, have on teachers, have on the community. Especially when I spent, that time as a school site principal, and then 9 years as an assistant super facilities. I got to see, kids and adults walking onto campuses that had been remodeled or remodernized, and of course, walking onto brand new campuses in a close unified school district. And I've talked to plenty of kids out on the lunchtime, and I always felt it was important to find time to talk to kids that were most disenfranchised on my campus. And those kids, without a doubt, even more so, recognize how lucky they are to be on a campus that's well maintained in current facilities, and that make them proud to be there. So that caused me to understand that there's a need in California to find empirical evidence that facilities make a difference, and they make a significant difference in student success, whether that be state testing, whether that be success on grades, success in graduation, in teacher retention, and teacher attitudes, and the community attitudes. So at that same time, I was doing something called a doctoral dissertation, and I did focus on facilities' effect on student achievement, and found that there is research out there, quite a bit actually, and felt like cash. If there's any place that in California that should house this information, it should be the Coalition for Adequate School Housing. So that's the narrative we were trying to counteract, that facilities are just, they're needed, they're important, but they, who really knows what effect they have, is kind of how I felt the legislature and some of the decision makers were thinking about this. So that's how the CSFRI was born. And at the time, the board of directors of CASH, approved another 501c organization. And, we thank those donors that helped us fund this operation right at the start. And I'm glad Julie did that, because those companies, those gentlemen and ladies that funded us, I really want to thank them, because it's just starting to really take some action here and some good steps, I think, that are going to benefit the kids and teachers of California. So ultimately, we want to publish and find the facts that detail the importance of the school facility environment and what really makes the most significant difference in a child's education. So with that being said, let's the first project that we've advertised, and we're interested in getting started as soon as possible. The idea here is that something called a meta-analysis approach would be our first step. And a meta-analysis really is pretty simple. It's a project, a research project that takes a look at a body of work or a study, and really it's a topic, and all the research on a certain topic that has the most significant correlations, right, is identified. And the best analogous analogy I can think of is, if you're on the education side of work, you probably recognize a researcher named Marzano. And Marzano did that meta-analysis approach for instructional practices. And as a principal and an on-site leader, I found that had a lot of merit with teachers, especially in the community, because the work had already been done. These are the 5 or 6 or 10 top 10 instructional practices that make a difference in student learning. And that's the same approach we'd like to take with our first project, is do a project that the researcher would go out and look at projects that have already been done and look for the highest correlations of current, and components of facilities that make a difference in student success and student achievement, right? So that way we already have a start on what makes the most differences in student achievement out there in the world of public education. So we've advertised, we've done a lot of outreach in the last kind of 18 months. That the culmination is these 2 seminars, symposiums to really further the discussion to make sure we're on the right point and we get people interested so we can go ahead and start this first project. Like the slide says, it's been advertised right now, and we've done fundraising and always can do more, but we have the funds we think we need to fund this first project and have a university take a look at this meta-analysis approach. And I think it's important to note too that people have heard this, but it's important that, you know, the first project or any project, I think that really can go to the legislature or go to constituents and ensure that it is unbiased is from a nonprofit organization. You know, there's been research done, and probably great research by private sector firms, usually in the role of some type of facility vendor, right? Where there's a furniture company, architectural organizations, and it could be great research, but it's hard to get that to be wholly taken as unbiased when a vendor has a natural interest in seeing how those results might come out. So we're looking for a university to take on this first project and get started. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and go to the first slide, or the next slide. And I think this is Mr. Becker.
Yeah, thank you, Don. Let me give a little bit of context about school construction funding in California and make the connection for us with the work of CSFRI. I know many of you are familiar with how this works in California. Some of you are from other states or may not be involved in this particular part of school construction. Historically, school construction is funded from three different sources. There are developer fees from new developments going in your district. There's general obligation bonds at the local level that districts put on the ballot locally and work very hard to pass for their projects. And then there are statewide funds, statewide bond funds. And together, those three funding sources for the past 20 plus years have worked well together to fund our projects. Right now, we have a broken leg on our stool, the state funding, and I'll talk a bit more about that on the next slide. But for many districts, when any one of those legs breaks, it brings down the whole stool and can create some issues with equity across the state and districts that do have local bonds or districts that may be maxed out on their bond capacity. So I really like that analogy of one broken leg equals an entirely broken stool. So next slide, please. So looking back at about the past 15 years of state school bond history, in November of 2006, this was a bond that was placed on the ballot by the legislature and governor with support, $10.4 billion for school construction. And then we went into the Jerry Brown era, and we went 10 years without a school bond for various reasons along the way. But we were not finding support for school bonds at the governor level and to some extent within the legislature, within that state bureaucracy. So in 2016, many of you know the story that cash bypassed the legislature and went through the initiative process and gathered signatures to put Prop 51 on the ballot. And we did have a success with that. It was a really big moment for school facilities, but we know that we had Prop 13 in March 2020. That was put on the ballot with the legislature and governor supporting. Unfortunately, it was given the Prop 13 ballot label and really opened the door for some of these false narratives that Don mentioned to come into play. And you can see it didn't fail by a lot, but it did fail. And so the work of CSFRI will be very important to work with our elected officials and policymakers on the importance of the infrastructure in schools. We went through that 10-year period where it was kind of discounted. It was something that, hey, if the local people want to pass a bond, they can do so, but the state maybe didn't have the same role. Well, we think the state does have that role, and we think that the work of CSFRI can be valuable as we present unbiased information to inform our policymakers of that. Certainly with Prop 13, there were some other factors involved, including at the local level. Many of the local bonds did not fare as well because of some ballot language from Assembly Bill 195, which caused some confusion among the electorate. And when you're confused about an issue, many people default to a no vote on that. But we're really looking forward to looking at a 22 bond, which has been introduced already in the legislature, and bringing this work of CSFRI into the conversation as soon as we can to highlight the importance of school facilities to students and to the learning process to help make that nexus a little bit stronger. So Julie, I believe the next slide is you. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. Great. You know, that really, I think, really is a clear, concise way to explain how school funding works for facilities in California. That made a lot of sense. So 2020 year of changes. So let's talk about the impact on students for a minute. These are photos of Palm Springs Unified School District students during distance learning. The top photo here is Esteban. He's a second grader. And we've got the bottom photo is Camilio, who's a fourth grader at Catherine Finchy. And as you can see, using the kitchen table or sitting on the floor at your grandmother's house is not a great education environment. Finding a quiet room becomes even more challenging when you have 2 or more children in one home. So even when students are able to return to classrooms, school activities will look different than prior years for at least the remainder of this year. The school facilities and maintenance communities have been focused on preparing staff and buildings for reopening and operating in a COVID-19 environment and beyond. But the question begs, what will help ensure we have a sustainable funding source as the CARES Act and other temporary funds run out? The COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in at least one positive thing, a much greater appreciation for the importance of our public schools. As parents struggle to work with their children at home due to the school closures, public recognition of the essential caretaking role of schools play in society has skyrocketed. As young people struggle to learn from home, parents' gratitude for teachers, their skills, and their invaluable role in student well-being has risen. Communities struggle to take care of their vulnerable children and youth. School administrators are having to devise new mechanisms for delivering services from education to food to healthcare. Next slide, please, Sam. So recognizing how important the physical environment of school is, MIT professor Martin Brezant and John W.M. Bush and Chasm Camp, they created this COVID indoor safety guideline. And it's a free online tool, and I'll go ahead and put it in the chat box when we're done here. But it really helps you understand how important the indoor environment really is. It's based on science, not guesswork. It's not just saying, oh, stay 6 feet apart from each other. It actually takes some calculations of your room. So it's interesting as these gentlemen believe schools should open with well-ventilated classrooms with teachers and students wearing masks. So next slide. With this, again, this tool revealed the risk of transmission is based on science. They believe schools should reopen with well-ventilated classrooms, and masks are still a critical component in keeping people safe until we have sufficiently vaccinated enough of our American people to get that herd immunity. So next slide. We all want to reopen schools, and we know the vital importance of opening schools must be done safely for teachers, students, and our classified staff. The importance of physically being in a classroom is vital, including sitting at a proper desk with good clean air, appropriate sound acoustics. Schools will reopen, and that begs the question, what do our schools need now and in the future for healthy classrooms? So more discussion is going to take place on this with our panels coming up. Also, we're going to be hosting future Zoom meetings to hear more from parties interested in being part of the CSFRI work. So the next slide. With that, I think we can all agree that our children matter, and our mission to make sure that all of our children and teachers can safely, securely re-enter their places learning very soon. We've been through hard times before, and we'll continue to get through hard times. The public schools are this country's central nervous system, and our students are our heart and soul of the nation. So one more time, before I have Don introduce Allison, I'd like again to thank the founding members and donors. Of course, Don as the founding chair for the CSFRI. And also again, Jean Hartline and April Hartline, Bruce Kern, Cecil Nicholas, John Smith, SIM, PBK Architects, Robert Thornton, Teeter Architects, Rick Davey, Davey Architecture, Mike Fennessy, Darden Architecture, and Jim DeCamillo, PBK WSC Architecture. So great information on that. And I think there were a couple of questions in the chat box here. And Don, maybe, and Jeff, if you got a second, jump back on. I think the big question was where and how was the RFP advertised? And also, people are looking for the link, if we can send it to the RFP.
Yeah, I can answer that, Julie, before I introduce Dr. Kwok. We advertised the RFP, I think it was back in November, December of 2018. I think you could still find a link if you Googled it, but we'll make it easier for everybody, and we'll get that link sent out to the participants so you can take a look at it. And just briefly, the first RFP we did, the feedback we got was that it was a little too detailed. In other words, kind of sharing too much information and being too pinpointed to the researcher. And so we broadened it quite a bit and changed it slightly. So that's the version you'll see out there now. I think I'm going to go ahead and move on, Julie, and introduce Dr. Kwok. Dr. Allison Kwok works at the University of Oregon, and I met her through, just publicizing, advertising, if you will, and outreaching to universities about the work we're doing to find interest and also to get feedback on how we can make it a better process. And I met Dr. Kwok through a contact at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and she and her team are very interested in how this goes. And we asked her today to talk a little bit just about her work and how the work she's done on how buildings can engage human beings and, of course, students in a better fashion through their design. So, Dr. Kwok, if you're ready, you can go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Very nice to be here. Very interested and very happy to meet this group. So I'll move on to the next slide. Let me tell you just a little bit about my journey. I started as a secondary science teacher in Hawaii for 8 years and taught in the public and private schools, and then kind of switched directions of really being interested in how science, health, energy can shape beautiful environments and change careers. Became an architect. I'm still a practicing architect, licensed in California and Oregon. And then I've been teaching for the last 20-something years at the University of Oregon, also at Cornell and some other places. But what I'm really, really interested in is, go next, of how design actually performs. So here there are some, we held a training session for teachers on architects, and they were kind of testing the temperature of the wall. And next slide. And then we took an infrared image of it. So I'm really interested in that intersection of design intent and actual outcome. So next. And what I'm briefly going to show today is some data on physical environments in schools, a couple of case studies of design process and pedagogy, and then some future questions. Next. So this is a study done by the Heshong Mahone group many years ago now, but it looked at 21,000 students in Orange County, Seattle, and in Fort Collins, Colorado. And they found that daylighting helps better performance on math tests and on reading reading tests, and they tracked fifth graders because in these fifth graders were in a classroom with one teacher. Later, another study looked at schools in Fresno. So there's data on that also. Next. This was some data from my dissertation where I looked at air-conditioned and naturally ventilated schools in the tropics. This is Hawaii. So we found that students that were in naturally ventilated classrooms were more comfortable than the students in air-conditioned classrooms. And I realized that that probably would not be true in many parts of California. But next, what we looked at was that we plotted the physical conditions of these classrooms, and you can see the comfort zone specified by ASHRAE. And next, the group of naturally ventilated classrooms was well outside of the specified comfort zone. It was hotter, it was a little bit more humid, but the air-conditioned classrooms, next, as shown by the blue circle, some were in the comfort zone and some were much, much cooler. As many of us know, there are places that are overcooled as well. So, but what the surveys were saying is that, hey, we're just right outside of the comfort zone, or we're too cold in these conditions. So, next. And we also looked at indoor air quality. We measured carbon dioxide. This is in both kinds of classrooms. You can see that the air-conditioned classroom, and this was a particular classroom that had a retrofitted window air conditioner, not centrally air-conditioned. So these high school students were progressing throughout the day to different classrooms, and they reached peak levels at the end of the class period and then dipped a bit during lunchtime right here, and then it started building up again. And the students in the classrooms were freaked out. They were saying, "What are we going to die?" I said, "No, you're not going to die, but you might get a little sleepy." But anyway, it just shows the major difference between kind of this indoor-outdoor air quality. Next. On the next few slides, there's some data that in schools, looking at pollutants and thermal conditions, that performance and attendance are influenced or mediated by these particulate or biological content in the air. Next. Ventilation and temperature has been strongly associated with scores in math and reading. And I know these tables are too hard to see on the screen, but there are associations with outdoor relative humidity, strong associations with indoor temperature, and then and ventilation rate. Next. And again, ventilation and temperature as outside temperatures that are outside of the comfort zone, but with lower ventilation rates can increase CO2, but also decrease student performance by as much as 30%. So these are all very important studies. And the next two case studies, what I want to show is that some work that we did on sort of the design process. And so we'll go to the next slide. And the design process where we interviewed the design team and looked at how they were getting to the goals of designing schools. So we rarely see this kind of information. It's those narratives that come out of interviews, as opposed to the beautiful award pictures without anybody in it. The goal with this particular school, this was a set of case studies that we did for the U.S. Green Building Council and on commercial buildings, and this particular one was Chartwell School in Seaside, California. And we talked to the architect, the executive director, the contractor, lighting consultant, the facility manager, the engineer, and put it all together in a book that looked at how did you get there? How did you achieve the goals of creating a school? This particular school, it's private, and their student population has students with dyslexia or some kinds of learning disabilities. They were really, really interested in creating a school that was welcoming and calming for students as they got onto the campus. It didn't feel so much like a school when they got there, and they were fostering respect for the environment, respect for teachers, and respect for the students themselves. So next slide. There were these daylit classrooms that were designed using a design and analysis. This is the Loop DA. It was an early program that could determine airflow, appropriate airflow, and amount of CO2, and window sizes and positions. Next slide. And there were a number of kind of, I think, charming spaces that for students to play and to be outside and be in learning situations with gardens and reclaimed wood, and to learn about green design and sustainability. It was a LEED Platinum school. Next slide. And I thought the interviews were the most revealing. This is from the facility manager, which where he said that he really wished that he was involved earlier in the design process, and where there was a focus and a conversation on the maintenance of systems, so that when he had to change the filters on the outside of a building, he didn't have to go into a classroom, rearrange the furniture, get to an indoor place, but that they would be on the outside so he could carry his ladders and such. Also said that when the students came on campus, they were just so excited and had a lot of pride in the facility. There was a bit of graffiti, he said, with chalk, but it was easily erasable, and because it was done in chalk. But the kids, he thought that the kids really, really reflect what their school is, as because they have some ownership of the space. So next slide. This is Case Middle School. It's actually part of a kindergarten through 12th grade school, but it's the middle school, and Case was the person that initiated some of the funding for it. But this was a 6th, 7th, 8th grade middle school that the school really wanted to make the entry for the students feel, how do we make a large school feel much smaller and much like a community? So the 6th grade was in the blue, the 7th was in the sort of pink, and then the 8th grade was, and they was in the purple. And then there were outside sort of creative learning buildings that were associated with the middle school, but not exactly in the classrooms. So this was a very, very early LEED project. I think it got LEED Gold, and it was just when LEED was starting. So the school is quite old right now, but I think the lessons were really important. Next slide. At that time, Herman Miller had, and many of you probably know this already, Herman Miller only did office furniture. And they partnered with the school and the teachers. There was a steering committee that met for 2 years, every week, with the architect and with the facility manager, where the architect just said, look, do not start designing the places for all the desks to go and how you want your classroom set up. Only talk about education. And so they listened, architects listened, and the facility manager listened. One of the outcomes of this was really looking at furniture and furniture design, combining the office furniture with the medical furniture, with medical carts for art supply storage, because they were indestructible. They had big drawers, they were color coordinated already for hospitals. And they kind of combined this and created furniture for the classrooms. With the desks, the teachers thought, well, we really want to do some collaborative learning. There were little slots in the desk that were anticipated for wiring computers. Now that's very different. At the time, they had a story where they brought in 25 caper chairs, you know, the ones with the wheels on it. That didn't go so well. They brought in 25 chairs, let the students at it, and you know what happened. They started sliding through the classrooms, and they said, okay, let's take the wheels off. We're doing casters instead. Next slide. We actually did some high dynamic range photography to take a look at how if there was glare potential in the classrooms, and just looking at those ratios of light spaces versus dark spaces and what the students see. Next slide. And this is sort of a montage of that the design of the classrooms were done as pods, so that there was social studies, math, English, and science as 4 classrooms that served as one part of the grade level. And there was a team space that could be entered through the pod, which was an open air, but shaded with bathrooms. And it was a space that the teachers could collaborate and do activities outside, either with their classroom or their own class, or collaboratively with each other. So when the students came to their homeroom, they would kind of cross this threshold, and it would be their community. So next slide. And the interviews with the school executive steering committee, and the engineer, the contractor, the facility manager, the president, and the principals of the school revealed that, you know, their educationally, their collaboration was really, really important between teachers. So adjacencies or connected spaces became important too, for either sharing visual connection or sharing an acoustical connection. in some cases of just kind of knowing what's going on, even shared storage spaces between classrooms. But the overall response for this particular school was that they called out the team spaces. Those we actually did a survey. It's undocumented, but it was a survey that I had done with 20 students about 6 years after they had come out of Case Middle School, and they said that their most memorable place was the team spaces, because they could hang out with friends, they could get to know each other, and it felt like a much smaller community. And so that, I think, says a lot about the middle school and the importance of social spaces for social and emotional learning. Next slide might be the, the future questions. So what really intrigues us about what everybody is doing here is, what are those key physical aspects of schools that will support learning and engagement? The indoor environments, the outdoor environments, classroom spaces, windows, adjacencies, outdoor spaces to engage with nature, creativity hubs, and then what are some other variables that we need to be cognizant of? Heat waves, fires, COVID, and so on. So I think the next one is the last slide, and it's a bit of a crowdsourcing question for everyone. Think about your most memorable part of your education, the school that you went to, and what was memorable about it? Where was it, and why was it memorable? Now, in some cases, it could be really good. In some cases, it might not be so good. But go ahead and put that in the chat, and then we'll try to coalesce those and get those back to you. So thank you very much.
Dr. Kwok, it's Tom Duffy. If we could go back a slide, Sam, please.
Yes.
What you're identifying here are future questions. The first two bullets.
Yep.
The indoor environment, classroom spaces, adjacencies, the outdoor environments. Those very things were the things that we put into the first RFP that
Wow.
we sent out to universities and colleges. They were in, as Don said, they were in great detail, and I can share that with you, where because of those of us that have been in the classroom environment as teachers, like Don and I, and have worked under various circumstances, we put together a substantially detailed list that
Mm-hmm.
caused the reaction of, you already know what you're looking for. Why are you asking us to do this study?
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't. We were simply saying, we know these are factors.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know how influential those factors are. And
Mm-hmm.
as a teacher, some of those factors may be more important to me because of what I do and how I teach, and to the grouping of students that I'm teaching. If I'm a special education teacher with the distractible students, there may be factors that are different from other students. But I just wanted to point out what you've captured here are significant, and we have them in even greater detail. And I'll share that with you. But I wanted to just comment on your slides, and thank you very much for what you shared with us.
Definitely have probably missed. It's a huge thing. So
That's what I was pointing out. It's when you talk about the indoor air environment or adjacencies, where do you begin and where do you end? Because there are so many variables. But thank you.
Yeah, so I see some things coming into the chat box, and it's fascinating. Some are more educational memories, and some are the actual spaces. Some are indoors, some are outdoors. very, it'll help shape some of those questions. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Julie? Well, thanks, Allison. Julie, I thought you were going to go ahead. This is Don again speaking.
The next slide and.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. Want me to go ahead and, yeah, I guess I am introducing this. Thank you. Well, what I'm going to do right now is just introduce a lot of people, but very distinguished people. They're going to talk about a lot of different topics here that concern school facilities. And, I want to start this off. It says, facilities impact on learning and student engagement. What do we know? And just a quick story about what we know, and I'm sure facility people and anybody in education probably has a story like this when it comes to facilities. And it's at a school in Clovis Unified, Pinedale Elementary, that back in 2012, when I was in facilities, we had passed a bond measure, and probably 2/3 of the funds were targeted for modernizing our existing schools. And Pinedale is in a community, one of our most impoverished and challenged communities, but a community with great pride. And really, their school was one of our facilities that we're proud of our facilities in Clovis Unified, but as we did our assessment back in the 9-10 school year was one we knew we had to do some work. And the stories about after the modernization that really built a new MPR, modernized every classroom, almost gutted the entire internal aspect of the classroom, and wall coverings, new technology, created more space. There was a funny alcove in every classroom, and it's about the first day that back to campus, and I was on campus that day, and it was I believe a second grade classroom that I was in, and parents were walking in with their kids on that first day. And the looks on the faces of those community members and the kids, and then what popped out of a second grader's mouth as she looked up at her mom was this. She said, "Mommy, they built a brand new school in my classroom." And the look on her face, from her perspective, she was in a new school. And if you don't think that is going to give that little child an attitude of she's ready to learn for that day and that year, I don't know what else would. So that's what we know in our gut, right? But I think what CSFRI is about, and I love the question Allison posed about, what are the key physical aspects of schools that will support the highest level of learning and engagement? And what empirically can we discover? And like Allison shared and I've shared, there is data out there, but it's bringing it together in the most significant way that we can use it in a concise manner with our constituents, with our legislature, with our governor's office, to really show why we need funding and resources for school facilities in California and across our nation. So with that, the first group is going to talk about infrastructure design. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce the first member that I believe is speaking. Kevin Fleming is a CASH board member, and he's also a principal in the DLR group, an architecture firm in California. So Kevin, are you ready?
Yeah, thank you, Don. Next slide. We're going to do quick self-introductions with the group of panels that I have. So Don said I'm Kevin Fleming, and I'm with our group, nationwide K-12 firm.
My name is Laura Noss, and I'm the education practice lead for Lionakis and our 4 California offices.
Hey everybody, I'm Jim DiCamillo, managing partner with PBK WLC, headquartered in Rancho Cucamonga.
Mike Fennessy, partner and architect for K-12 with Jordan Architects in Fresno, California.
Next slide. So architects do rely on research as we design. So I wanted to make sure that we're going to talk a little bit about the various aspects of research that do influence our decision-making process, with knowing that the research does influence how we design architecture, but that's setting the stage for the education, and we want to make sure that there's plenty of research about how education is taught that is equally as important as the architecture that supports it. Next slide. Another aspect that is very important just on the research is just the data and the numbers. You know, finding out what is needed in the state of California, especially for the next 30 years, just how much does it cost us to maintain our facilities? These are types of research that do influence us as architects and facilities directors as we move forward. Next. So today we're kind of breaking up into three kind of subgroups here: the planning process, the implementing process, the observing process, and my G dropped. That's fine. And the fact that it's cyclical and they inform each other, and it's kind of a continuous process with the outside influence of other research that does come into play. So Mike, let's turn it over to you.
And thank you, Kevin. Next slide. I'm going to spend maybe just a minute on this, talking about maybe the experiences and how we're going to start here. We're going to start really at the end of the process, but it's important to understand that in the beginning because it helps influence us all the way through. First of all, Darden Architects several years ago was challenged by Don Ulrich on two objectives. How do you build the most cost-effective, results-oriented school in the nation? And we knew that 21st century schools and environments were happening all around us. And so we started doing our own research, and that process led us over the span of 2 years where we studied 50 schools throughout our country. And that meant also including visiting them, talking to board members, superintendents, teachers, staff, students, and really trying to understand what was going on. And we learned a lot through that process. In the end, we found out that most successful places implemented this strategy or this idea of educational commissioning by bringing other people besides the facilities department, the business department, on board early on about trying to define the character and the qualities of those educational spaces. So these are just some bullet points I'll be kind of covering, and let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So educational commissioning, there's a little definition right there, but that middle sentence is what I like to focus on a little bit. It's basically a process that supports teaching and the learning objectives. And so early on, what designers and educators want to do is define some of these things down here by looking at existing research that's going to support some of the design goals. Looking at the learning styles. Are you just doing direct instruction like you've been doing for the last 100 years, or are there different kinds of learning styles? Helping to work with curriculum and assessment and identifying their objectives, understanding how teachers are trained, but also looking at maybe a metrics also for post-occupancy assessments. And more importantly, maybe in that whole idea too, is building in that design schedule, this process to get this team of educators part of that design process from the beginning all the way to the end. And one of the tools I'll talk about in a moment is the idea of crafting an educational design brief. Next slide. So as we said, school facilities matter. One of the things that I talk about in our own practice in the office as well as outside are these bullet points. And maybe very similar to other designers, but sometimes they're a little bit different, is really focus on the design solutions in collaboration with educators, trying to broaden that design community. Kind of like I talked about, bringing in curriculum, assessment, instruction, instructional technology into that process early on. But also look at it from that sense that Allison, you're talking about is, what do those student experiences want to be like? Design it with empathy and respect, trying to create those spaces that those teachers want to occupy as well as the students. Design from the inside out instead of the other way around. But also, go ahead. Okay. Schools need to be relevant and learning relevancy, but also focus on really student-centered learning and bringing in also that research early on with that delivery method. Next slide. So before we begin, what we want to do is unpack, and usually it's working with school districts in the ed spec process is trying to define the learning styles that are being deployed or they want to maybe achieve in that new educational facility or redesign. The top of the ballpoint is what we're very used to, is the simple direct instruction, the stage on the stage kind of delivery instruction like it has been. But there's all kinds of different learning styles and teaching techniques with pedagogy that are being implemented in the world around it. So trying to understand what they are. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit of how we jump into the implementation on this. And it combines vision, commitment, which is really big, staffing and training. Next slide. So the process, I know with anybody as you're moving through facilities and bringing in new people, it's going to be really different. So there has to be a commitment early on, not to simply bring in the people from facilities and the business department, but also bringing in, again, those teachers on special assignment, curriculum assessment, instruction, instructional technology, the people who help define those teaching spaces. And you need to get commitment across the board from the superintendent and the board to support what you're trying to do. Otherwise, it's just going to be maybe led at a school site and it may kind of peter out. Identify the leadership. Who are the people you want to bring to the board through this process? And then take your vision and blend it with the instructional and organizational cultures that you have at the schools. Ultimately, flexibility in design and furniture need to meet short and long-term goals. So those are kind of my slide on commitment. Next slide, please. So as we begin to really work with the educators and maybe kind of create those big ideas and trying to craft a written narrative and graphic document that kind of brings out the spirit of what you want to design, we encourage people to do something like this where you create an educational design brief, where you're just kind of getting the text on the page, you're going through maybe kind of creating a Pinterest style presentation, getting images from other classrooms, other spaces that you like to kind of gravitate what you want to do, and you're trying to throw all this together. But it's really going to be divided into three basic categories. The outcomes, what are the outcomes you want in those spaces for the students? What are the learning experiences going to be like? And how's that being supported through curriculum? And once you kind of begin to pull out in the essence of the different types of spaces and the learning styles that are being used, this will help you to create a brief for each type of learning style. Next slide, please. This is an example of what we did for Coalesce Unified, a small facility, 5,000 square foot CTE project, but there's no facility too big or too large that you can invoke this process of educational design brief. So meeting with the school side and the teachers, they threw out all their ideas and we tried to capture them. And what are the teaching styles? What are the teaching experiences? Do you want to have outdoor learning spaces and the types of spaces inside and the pull-out spaces, the spaces for those students to kind of collect and kind of click with each other? And so you see a little bit of the narrative that we put together early on. This is before we put pencil to the paper, and then some photos of what the actual project when it was finished. And those people we kind of listened to all the way through and looked at the schematic design, design development, construction drawings, part of the construction. You know, are we hitting those objectives that we set out to do in the very beginning? So it was a very successful project. Next slide, please. The big thing, and I think that Allison, maybe you brought up a little bit, is the need to maybe start early. One of the project we're going through right now, high school, it took us 1 year to develop the ed specs. The schematic design has really taken an undaunting 1 year to go through the set of schematic design. So we did a lot of heavy lifting and bringing research and talking about ideas and curriculum early on. So we had to go slow so that now that we can actually pick up the speed and move forward with the design. Next slide. So in that process of what we wanted to do when we defined the ed specs is this is a great time to really look at the research, talking about, you know, obviously Allison, you talked about, you know, air conditioning and lighting, but other things such as transparency in spaces. Transparency is a really big thing that we're dealing with design. A lot of pushback. How does transparency and vision outside of spaces at the outdoor, how's that supporting the everything inside? So bringing people, pieces of research like that early on to help them make those comfortable decisions is really good. And so next slide, please. Once we move into the design process too, that's when you want to get that research and you want to begin combining that and developing the concepts. And those concepts are kind of being later on top of the schematic designs. And so you're, again, meeting with those instructional people and who don't really talk about planning and floor plans and stuff like that, and understanding kind of what's happening in those spaces. And obviously in the world we live in, 3D presentations are very, very easy to do. So next slide. Ultimately, and actually before I pass it off, again, this is the conclusion, the big points that I want to make with you. It takes courage and long-term planning to design for what you want to do. Don't take it easy and just saying, let's rush through that. So the last other thing here, expediency is the enemy of innovation. So if you want to go through a 21st century learning space and design something with research, it's going to take a while. So you need to actually plan early. So I'm going to pass the torch now to Jim, who wants to talk about a little bit more about the design process. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, everybody. Again, Jim DiCamillo, PBK WLC. When I got tapped on the shoulder for this presentation, Kevin said, you got 3 minutes, tell us everything you know about architecture. So this is in 3 slides. What I wanted to focus on here is that these discussions have been going on for a very, very, very long time. This is a continuum. We are not at the end of it. We're not at the start of it. We're somewhere in the middle if you looked at the long timeline of school design in the world and in California, the United States, whatever environment you want to say. I cut my teeth doing design planning. I'm a past McConnell Award winner. That's sort of the Heisman Trophy, if you will, of school space planning design. So I think my panelists here would agree that this is really the guts of what all school architects are doing. Very different from speculative architecture in office building design or residential. We are very much so attuned to what are you going to use these buildings for. And these 3 slides will talk mostly about what are you going to use these spaces for and the spaces that they're next to them. I think everybody knows there's sort of this basic DNA to an educational program and facility that really goes to the guts of where the real major learning activities are going on, and whether that's what we would have traditionally called a classroom space or has now blended into some of the collaborative and other educational spaces that we all know from the jargon, the seminars we've attended, just like this one. But when we as architects inherit the work that Mike and his group just talked about, what we are doing is shaping those spaces to be unique to the design that we're creating. And that might be on a particular site, or it might be a wing of a school addition. So we're very much so interested in the configurations and adjacencies of these spaces, where the ed spec might tell us that you want a space that's quiet. The architect is now going to work with a design team to figure out what it's supposed to be quiet from, where Dr. Kwok's analysis would show that daylighting is really good for a classroom. The architect is trying to figure out, well, that's wonderful, which direction is this classroom facing? Because of all it's doing is just creating glare on your desktop while you're trying to take the SAT exam. That's going to be a disaster. So we're bringing in the extra layers of the specific school design, and how do we both make the building functional for what teachers want to use it for, but also instructional to the students beyond the instruction they've been told they're supposed to be getting in those spaces. Next slide. So along with the kind of base DNA, there are also a lot of other spaces that go on there that have become more and more educational. I was watching the chat go by on the bottom and seeing that everybody's remembrance of school were pretty much the spaces that had nothing to do with being in a classroom. And the old adage of, can we go outside? I think probably would have been repeated in half of the responses. And I think you're seeing that more and more and more in our design work these days, that education can happen everywhere. That is not because architects suddenly got smarter. I'm a big cause and effect guy. It's because the way that we learn has changed. And so it is just as easy to have kids gathered in a courtyard or in a patio, the two right-hand shots in this slide, where you can actually still hold the technology in your hand. You don't have to be tethered to a wall, to power, to get all of this done. So as we see technology evolve, we also see the architecture basically transform itself in relation to it or in response to it. And then my last slide, next. I think what probably prompts architects to be architects more than anything else is the spaces in between. And these are the spaces that, if it wasn't outside, it was those spaces that everybody was chatting about. It was the places where things actually happen in school, which aren't so programmed or so specific. These are the whimsical spaces, the impromptu spaces, the gathering spaces, the circulation spaces. That is probably where, if you've been through the entire system, it's probably where you bumped into some of your longtime best friends. It's maybe where you met, your girlfriend slash fiance slash wife of however many years. These are the spaces when things actually occur, where an instructor can pull a student aside. They're very hard to program, very hard to put in an ed spec, but it is really the interactive spaces where we begin to learn in a different way than was ever even programmed. And architects, the skill set that we bring is how to make those spaces engaging as well, even if they're very hard to describe in a technical document like an ed spec. And I love the fact that this quote I found in preparing this was actually from Benjamin Franklin, who was himself thinking about this. And you can go back to the Greeks, where they were talking about where are the places where we can really engage and learn in these creative ways. This last set of spaces, I think, is really what gets the architect's heart pumping as we fold in things like aesthetics and ambiance, as I mentioned earlier, solar access, orientation, and then those even fine-tuned things like mechanical and electrical systems. All of this goes into the design. Or, as I'm often fond of saying, it's like trying to prepare Thanksgiving dinner. If you can get a document and it's just a list of ingredients, well, that's a grocery list. That's not a recipe. The grocery list of everything I do to make Thanksgiving dinner is really long, but it doesn't tell you how to make a single dish. So the architect brings all of those things together, puts the ingredients in order, and tries to implement those early planning on pedagogy ideas and see if we can make spaces, or as I'm often fond of saying, making places out of spaces. That's the architectural, that's the center of it all. And then when Mike's done programming and we're done designing, we turn it over, come full circle, and Laura will talk about what happens with all of that next.
Thanks, Jim. Next, please. So we finished the project. What have we learned? There are qualitative things. We can judge those with post-occupancy evaluation, and there are quantitative things, some of the research that Allison referenced and we discussed earlier in the presentation. So I think, next please, as we move forward, we want to make sure that everyone's excited, right? We're cutting the ribbon, we're in the new space, the school or the modernization is complete, but have we done what we promised? And do we take the time and effort that we spend up front? Mike mentioned even up to a year for ed specs. Do we take that time at the end to ensure that we persist, that it sustains itself, all of the things that we planned for this exciting new facility? Next, please. Building commissioning is one of the ways that we can do that. In the building commissioning, some of that is mandated, of course, by code. But as we look at the phases of building commissioning, one of the areas, the ongoing monitoring, is an area that we feel we can learn a lot about what to do in our next steps and the future of our buildings. As I mentioned, how do we really sustain these efforts? While some of that commissioning is mandated, how we move forward, how we, through our maintenance and operations, ensure that the systems and the educational environment persist is kind of the magic of this post-occupancy phase. Next, please. like many areas of the building, we design to a high expectation. It's either code required, it's best practice, or it's to support those educational goals we established. We prepare models like you see here, modeling in 3D as many of the variables as we can to propose the strongest solution. Rarely, though, do we go back and test those solutions to be sure that they are successful. That level of commissioning and that ongoing monitoring really ensures that the design intent is met and sustained. Next, please. We hear a lot about the research on daylighting, for example. We've talked, next please. We've talked a little bit about the view windows and the transparency. But if we knew for a fact that daylighting and view windows, and we were commissioning for it and monitoring it on a regular basis, would we end up with this? Next slide, please. Because if we knew that that transparency and that green view and the daylighting was good for kids and did improve student performance and well-being and attention spans, and we taught the teachers about the research related to this, I think that we would see more of these shades open and more connection to the outdoors. Next, please. We design to an elevated level to ensure quality acoustics in our classrooms, but rarely do we measure those results. And measuring those results really can have consequences. What are the expectations for maintaining the seals, the sweeps, the sound isolation on these systems on a regular and ongoing basis? We know, especially for English language learners, that acoustics in the classroom are a huge issue, and that's why our code standards have been risen over time. But very seldom do we test that theory and measure the results and make sure they align. And then what are our expectations to maintain those systems on an ongoing basis? Next, please. We started to talk a little bit about HVAC and ventilation. Are we regularly monitoring the ventilation rates, the CO2 levels, mold and other contaminants in our schools? And then more importantly, how will these systems that we originally designed, the original intent was to improve the occupant well-being, how will they look in 5 years or 10 years? Will those, with proper maintenance and operations, those systems can persist and continue to provide the environment that we know elevates student performance and well-being? Next, please. Can we connect the benefits of ongoing monitoring to student outcomes and remind ourselves of it when maintaining our facilities? I think Allison started to use an anecdote about one of the maintenance folks on one of the school sites. Given this information and armed with this kind of data, their motivation to keep buildings maintained and to check for these things can certainly be elevated, just like all of us can be elevated by what we learn. Next, please. When we work really hard during the design phase with engaged stakeholders to develop spaces that engage students like these, or next slide, please, or some of these spaces, as Jim was talking about, are we leaving their success to chance? Or can we use qualitative data to test in the early days of the project and beyond? Next, please. And that is where post-occupancy surveys really come into play. Some of that qualitative data is really important in not only what we do, what the school district does with the facility moving forward, but what we as architects do on our next project and future projects in our industry. So the post-occupancy surveys give the opportunity to gauge early feedback. Maybe it's 3 months, 6 months into the use of the new facility. I can tell you that if you do your post-occupancy survey while punch list items are still being dealt with, you'll find a lot of people that all they can focus on is a scratch in the paint or a threshold that's not correct. So letting them live in it and adjust to the new facility, I think, is really important. Educators, students, community members, administration, they all have a voice in how this building is performing, either from a perception standpoint, a community standpoint, or as educators and students who are using it on a daily basis. All of these things can influence not only the future work of the district, but for us as architects, we're continually learning. We're getting better every time, and the post-occupancy can help with that. Next, please. We had the opportunity to do twin classroom buildings. They were 2 years apart. We did post-occupancy on the original campus, including the first building, and we were able, with the district, to make modifications to the second one and to dig into those a little deeper with the educators and students that responded to the post-occupancy so that we could fine-tune and adjust in that second building. That kind of learning environment, that kind of learning agency really can inform not only this school and its second building, but future schools in this district and beyond. Next, please. Can we go back to a school several years later and see how teachers are hacking their spaces? Will this guide how we look at future spaces? In this case, there's a lot of furniture-related hacking that's happening, but those kinds of things like poster board over windows that are providing too much glare in a classroom. We can learn from that and do better, and learn what we would do differently the next time around. Next, please. Which really brings us back to Mike's conversation about educational commissioning. On the front end of the project, you're developing the ed specs and really listening to teachers, how they're doing the business that they're doing. But on the back end of the project, being able to do educational commissioning with the teachers to not only share with them what the intention was of the design and the educational specifications, but also how to use that facility and what are they teaching us about what their needs are. We know that traditional patterns will continue if we don't do something to shake that up. And so designing all the new facilities in the world, if we don't provide that training and that process on the back end, makes for difficulty in implementation.
And then
Kevin?
next slide. As we're going to wrap up real quick here, I think it's really important that we're trying to reinforce in this little discussion is the fact that by observing and measuring what we did, we get to find out what works. And that helps in our own personal research and our design and implementing that design. One of the things that is very kind of interesting to me is like over the last 20 years plus, just the technology available for research, collecting and analyzing data and making it useful to the design and the educational world has just increased dramatically. So there's a lot more research available than there was just because of the sheer technology. Next slide. Just for an example, I know all of us architects, we have been reviewing this stuff since like Jim and I were talking about Christopher Alexander and the pattern language way back in the 60s, before I was born, but Jim was around. 172 research papers. This is what we personally have on file in DLR group that we have vetted, looked at, and implemented in some way into our design process through research. And then the last thing is when we don't find it, last slide please here. When we don't find the availability of the stuff that we're looking for, we develop it. And I know that PBK and I know Laura, and I think we all have our own little internal ways of developing research, but for 10 years, we created a student and teacher engagement index where we measure the impact of the facility on the students and teachers over time. And again, to gauge what works, what doesn't, what increases student participation, attendance, even teacher retention, all of it, which has an educational impact for the future of the children, as well as a financial impact on the facilities and the school districts. I believe that's it. And please add questions. I see a lot of comments coming through, but add the questions in the chat room. Since it's live, I believe we keep these recorded as well.
Let me just ask the four of you, and this is Tom interrupting one more time, but just drinking from the fire hose of all that you have just shared with us, which was phenomenal, and also of Dr. Quox, what keeps coming to mind is the experiences I had where it was something other than all the good things that directed really what was to be built. And that was something called funding. So how much today does funding influence the design of schools?
Well, just quick off the shot, funding, I think creativity and funding is always going to be a challenge in architecture no matter what you do. Throwing more money at it does not necessarily make a better solution. We've all, I think, learned that through our careers, 25 plus years. I think the most important part of this whole thing is just having the right questions and the ability to look through the manipulating processes of, like, California Department of Education, the Office of Public Construction. There's more constraints on the outside looking into the process sometimes than the designers and the school districts on the inside looking out.
And I would agree with Kevin. You know, great places, as opposed to spaces, great places rarely have to be expensive. And most of the chat room discussion I've seen down below on the screen really doesn't have a lot to do with how much was spent on the place. It's really the feeling you get when you're in it and the kind of learning environment that you can create, which often has nothing to do with the quality of the flooring. It's really just the quality of the place.
And I think that from, you know, the piece that I talked about, in that perspective, it's the funding and availability of spending the time after the facility is complete to do the work of training and teaching and persisting. And sometimes that's where everyone's best intentions are lost, is that we haven't spent the time with the educators. We haven't even trained the principals or leaders of the campus so that they can continue to use the facility in the way it was intended and get the maximum benefit. And so, you know, there's facilities funding, of course, but I think there's also that training component and keeping the architects on to help do some of that training. I see some of the themes in the chat are around those kind of additional services and proving their value to the project and its success overall.
Yeah, this is Dawn. I think a couple of you hit the nail on the head when you talked about there's not a lack of funds, more than likely, to, as long as you set your priorities that are based on research. And I think that's what a lot of us are after, is that, you know, it's readily understood by facility professionals, by our constituents, by educators, of what those components are, you know, that make a difference. And I'm, you know, really impressed with this panel of some of our leading architects in California. And when you hear all of you talk, the work you've done already, as one of you said, you know, it's ongoing. I think Jim said this. It's ongoing. We're in the middle, and probably will never get there. But it's great to see that you all are thinking about what is the best research, you know, and you have done a lot of it already. I think part of our method could be, you know, connecting better with architects on the research they've already done. And part of that is maybe what CASH can do, you know, is be this holder of the most significant research out there that perpetuates what we're trying to accomplish. I thought it was also really telling in that, you know, as we do this work, one of the chat comments was, I want to read it here, that how our teachers transitioned to these new buildings from traditional buildings, right? And I think what that means to me is, and I've talked about this a lot and recognized it a lot, and other people have as well, is that you can do everything you want in a new facility, that is changing maybe from a traditional classroom. But until those teachers are transitioned, or I would use the word trained, robust staff development in the pedagogies that can use those new facilities, you know, your research will be skewed. So I think that's part of what I'm learning is as we do this research and find research that's been done, you have to account for that. And I think we have to perpetuate that. Educational leaders make sure they add that training component and staff development component to use in a new building. Well, are we ready to move on to the next section here on interior design and furnishings?
I just wanted to touch base on what you said.
Sure.
I think it's really important because we, as being in the industry, you know, we see the project, we see the grand idea, and really getting students and teachers to take ownership, kind of like that story that you shared earlier about the little girl saying, you know, they built a new school in my classroom. More often than not, I feel that sometimes students and teachers, if their, you know, classrooms are falling apart, if they don't feel they're getting the attention that they deserve, they kind of have less of an interest and less of like, this is my school, I take such pride in it. And then they move on to bigger and better things. And, you know, it's important that if we want to retain the great staff and have students take that pride and sense of ownership, that we treat the facilities as, you know, somewhere we would want to be every day. I think you're muted there, Don.
I just said, you know, I think it's important that as we continue this discussion, you know, we just always think about the child's perspective as well. And sometimes you have to dig that out a little bit. I really also wanted to point out that I think it was Laura that talked about post-occupancy, and she made me think about the length of that. You know, that it's not just even 6 months after you enter the building, but I think she might have used the term, you know, revisit that classroom and see what teachers have done to it. Maybe, you know, even a couple years down the road gives you a good indication of some of what you can learn from a design. Well, I think time-wise, we better move on. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Jenny Hanna. She's going to kick off the topic of interior design and furnishings.
Thank you, Don. I'm Jenny Hanna Brown. I'm a former CASH chair right before Don, and was really honored to be invited today to be part of this panel. I'll introduce the rest of our group. We have Suzanne Sasaki Hartstein from Rainforest Grau Architects, Brian Wimmer with Meteor Education, Kathy Virtue with Verco, and Zoe Mayu with the Thomas Jefferson University. So thank you, our group, and thank you to all the previous speakers. It's been a really good morning of conversation, and our topic is about the interior space specifically and furnishings. We know that all of this goes together. This is one part of that environment, whether it's interior or those spaces in between. I love that conversation about that. Outdoor spaces that frequently, and I know from my past life as a commercial interior designer, that was always thought of, or that piece of the design was always thought of as, you know, the after. You're done with the architecture, you're done with the programming. Okay, now make things fit, make it beautiful, do the icing on the cake, right? So I think this conversation is very well melded into what everybody's been discussing. The interior equipping, the interior aesthetics, the colors, all of these things are part of the cake mix, right? And we have to take those into consideration from the very beginning of when we talk about the ed specifications, when we talk about goals and what we want these schools to do for students in particular, and the teachers that are using them as those tools. I have said this before, and I want to bring it up again because part of my personal story was this enlightenment of when I moved from private work through an architectural firm, and I came into the facilities world in a school district. And everything I was doing previously led me to that path. And I suddenly found that there was so much more personal gratification in looking at what I was doing that actually could impact students' ability to learn and be proud and really kind of own their space in a way that I never really found in other types of practices I was doing. Although what I would say is that what I've heard a lot about today is much of what we've learned through architecture and design and programming spaces for use has long been understood by the healthcare industry and even to some respect corporate America in terms of business office design, that spaces impact healing, how we feel in a medical space, very important. There's lots of studies on that. And also how in business environment, how we perform ourselves at our workspaces. So, so interior design, aesthetics, colors, furnishings, very important in terms of function, obviously. But I think our panel is ready to talk to you today about beyond the functional and how you go about incorporating successful furnishings and interiors in your project. So I'd like to start with Suzanne. She has some interesting comments about how to do this with architectural firms.
Thank you, Jenny. I just want to say that, when I first got into the industry, I think I did my internship probably 20 years ago now. I fell in love with designing schools because I realized that, after studying interior design, I could make an impact on a child's education just by creating an effective space. So, interior designers have a way of thinking about the inside of a space differently and find the importance of, creating spaces and places where people want to be. I say all the time to, people when they ask what I do for a living, I do a lot more than pick paint and carpet. There's so much more to interior design than what people see on TV. And, one of my little driving quotes is, when a student walks into school on the first day of the year, it really sets the tone for how their school year is going to go. So how do we create places that, excite a student when they walk in the door on the first day?
Okay.
And,
I'm in a webinar, but I'm listening because
but make a space where, they want to come back every day and places they want to be. And, for me, it's really important to bring the interior design team onto a project early because there's a lot of, places we can create that are really hard to add after the fact. And those small places that aren't necessarily part of your ed specs and part of your program really create the spaces that, people kind of gravitate to. And I think that's what was interesting in reading all of the chat comments was, and I think somebody else brought it up earlier, is you start reading the places that people remember and it's not necessarily their classroom. But one of our goals is, the classrooms are very important. So similar to the picture that's on the screen now, there's a way to infuse energy and color while still meeting the educational program. Simply by having the conversation about what's important, how a teacher wants to use their space, and then infusing it with some things that are going to be fun for the students, because when you talk to them, they want more than white walls and a big TV. And so that's really important.
Suzanne, how would you say, if the school district's interested in this, and if the architect is maybe not bringing the interiors person forward initially, how does one go about saying that that needs to be part of that upfront conversation?
I know we had this conversation previously when we were talking, and it's just, I think I told you guys I had spent a large portion of my career clawing to get onto projects sooner, to, tell people that it was important to be in on projects from the beginning, to be in the programming. So from a design perspective, I know as designers, we push to have the most influence we can. From a district's perspective, I have clients that I work with regularly that will ask, when is interiors coming on, because they have things they want to talk to us about. The slide on the screen right now was a library space that we had done, and it had a lot of programming questions, that the site wanted. They wanted to be able to hold their school site meetings in here. They wanted to be able to hold an entire classroom, but they had these buddy reading programs on campus where the older kids would be paired up with younger kids and help coach them through learning to read if they were struggling, learning. And being able to create the combination of spaces where the kids could break out and spaces where they're comfortable. So whether it be sitting on a couch or sitting at a table or hiding in one of those little cutouts in the bookshelves, it allowed the students to be able to learn an environment where they were comfortable. But coming on early allowed us to program it into the space and make sure that space was going to function the way they wanted to use it and to the best ability for the students.
Yeah, that's really a good point. Isn't it interesting that the furniture, the part of the beauty of it is it can be moved and used and morphed into more interesting configurations and things. Architecture, obviously harder to do that with, but then that's also the downside that we run into as well, right? So, the rows of chairs and things that without the training and the education and that commissioning that we all talk about and we know that we need, can quickly become turned back into a very traditional classroom. So all of that is interesting. I see in the chat something that's really interesting about the effect on cognition and physical health and psychological well-being of interior design. And I really believe that aesthetic beauty, the colors, if we pay attention to that, that all builds on that level of respect that our students and teachers can gain from being in a beautiful functional space, that it is important. Long before I'd even heard of these studies and research, I knew it just from how I respond as an adult to those kinds of spaces, and how it makes me feel and all. So we at CASH, when I was chair, we had just dipped our toe a little bit into what I tell Tom Duffy is the touchy-feely part of design in our schools. And we had a speaker, and I apologize, I don't remember his name, but his book was Fidget to Focus, and he was a psychologist in Southern California, and he talked a lot about how it was necessary for some students to have the ability to move, to be able to learn. And so that to me brings up the question about some of our most sensitive students in our schools are our special education students. And I know that Brian on our team has some experience with that. And Brian, maybe you could talk a little bit, give us some insight into that background and some of your thoughts in your current work.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jenny. And I just have to say the conversation that's been happening today, I absolutely love, especially like Mike and everybody was bringing up in the first talk around really that educational commissioning and I saw that as Jenny, as you mentioned, I was a special education teacher working with a population of third through fifth graders who had emotional disabilities as their diagnoses, so behaviors that impeded their learning. So really looking at how to create an environment that was inviting, that students wanted to come to, and that really helped soothe them was extremely important. So Suzanne, what you're talking about and what others have brought up about lighting and color and how that space affects students really played into my room. I actually had my fiance, who loves to paint, come in, and I had a little room that she painted to have a tree scene and a sun and all of those things, because they put my students who needed all this extra sensory input in the middle of the school building, because that was the safe spot for them. No windows, only fluorescent lights. So I had to do all sorts of things to try and create that environment, from covers over the lights, you know, those blue covers to help reduce the fluorescent lights, painting the room, all of that stuff. And I think taking into consideration those individual needs of learners is just so important to helping students achieve the most that they can. We've seen research coming out now how seating can be really important for students, whether they need to fidget or they need a strong base below them, maybe a higher seat to help them see over others. And it really comes back to the body. I heard an interesting presentation by an orthopedic, an occupational therapist, who was talking about proprioception, which is the body's system that interprets what it's doing and the outside senses and how that affects your body, and talking about how, you know, a body at rest wants to go to sleep, and a body in motion wants to get blood to the brain and wants to be engaged and active. So simply by asking kids to sit and be quiet, we're already putting them behind the 8 ball for learning from what we know the body reacts. So I think taking that into consideration early in this process is really key to look at those individual learners. Whether that is a special education class where an IEP dictates what we need to do for them, or that general ed class where we just know these kids need that type of input as we're going forward. So yeah, I think that's really important. And I know there's a lot that this panel has to share on that. So
yeah,
back over.
Yeah, I think that's good information. I have always felt that our special education students are kind of the canaries in the coal mine with regard to some of this, and we can learn a lot because they do have much more amplified special needs, much more amplified need for individual considerations for the spaces that they learn in. So, so Kathy, I think you're the owner of this photo, and I'd like for you to talk about that a little bit with regard to your experiences.
I am the owner of this photo. On the call that we were discussing kind of the topic, I mentioned that there was a space I had gone into that made me anxious as an adult. And this was the space. This is just one of the views, but bless her heart, she was one of the most innovative teachers, according to the principal, who's in the picture there. And this was her struggle to try to give her children something different. And I was brought in to say, what could you do to help us? Because the principal recognized that things coming in from all over the place that weren't NCBIFMA tested, weren't CPSIA compliant, weren't Green Guard compliant, weren't bolted to the walls, weren't hygienic, that she realized she had a problem and needed some sort of help. And from this, she actually went to the superintendent and said, you know, we need to do something as a district, because this is, everybody is trying something different, all in an attempt to give their children choices, room to move, choose to move, you know, doing something different in a space, but this isn't working. And, you know, it was from that organic level, from the ground up, so to speak, that they started to have this conversation. And when you're talking about how long a process goes on, this was more than 4 years ago. And we're just now, you know, actually delivering the first school that came about because of that conversation. And how, you know, there were pilot classrooms. I mean, it was 4 years of back and forth and conversations before we actually got to the point where they decided on what they really wanted to do and to provide equity. And that was the other thing that this principal recognized as well, is that you can build a brand new school and it can be beautiful for that community. And then you can have all of the other schools that are older in the community that don't have that same opportunity. So how do you do an equity-based program for all of your learners, all of your community? And that's what I really loved about, I mean, the picture is chaotic, but out of it came something really beautiful, which was an understanding that every student deserved to have, even if it was just at minimum, a new desk, a new chair, a new space, a new table, a new learning space. And that's what came out of this picture. And I've known Zoe for many, many years, and she spent, I'll just say, over 30 years, Zoe, working with all the 5 senses and how they affect us in our environments. And I shared with her that when I saw this picture, I felt like I was hyperventilating. And if I looked back at my education and when I was a kid, how this room would have made me feel, and I would have wanted to run. I would have looked at the couch and said, it's smelly, it's got cooties. Where can I go to kind of get away from everything? Because it was too much stimulation. So that was why I chose this picture, because it spoke to me personally, but it also had a happy ending where all of the kids in this district will now get something new. And I credit the principal for seeing an opportunity here to do something more for the entire district.
So could I build on that, Jenny? Yeah, and I've loved this whole discussion. I love how holistic it's been and the consideration of so many elements. It does seem often when we think about physical space and place that we do focus on visual and auditory, which are very important. As an occupational therapist I've worked with the sensory systems for most of my career, working for many years with children who have conditions like autism and learning disabilities, attention disorders. And through that work, really understood fully that we all function in ranges of things that we have preferences for, elements that are bothersome to us. So just to build on this idea that while children with special needs certainly can help inform what is needed, it's really all of us. And the more that we understand that these preferences and hindrances affect everyone, I think then the more impact we can have, so that rather than just thinking about that certain children need these things, really we all do. We've all been sitting for a while. It's probably especially the panelists. So, as Brian mentioned, our brain is programmed that when we're sitting too long, we think it's time to go to sleep. One of my big hopes is that eventually we can have furniture that does address more of the sensory needs. You didn't butcher proprioception, Brian. That's a very important sense that most of us, we actually have at least 7 senses that are very important. And proprioception, our position sense, is so critical, and we never get it right in classrooms if we put all children in a classroom in the same size chair. I mean, an individual student isn't even the same size in September as they are in June. So we need furniture that will afford children to be at appropriate, ergonomically appropriate heights. And we need furniture that provides some movement. I've yet to found an adult in a school who's sitting in a 4-legged stable chair. I don't know about all of you at home. Probably most of the participants have been up and walking around and moving around. And probably most of the panelists are sitting in some kind of a swivel or moving chair. We have to get children out of stable chairs, but this training idea is so important for the teachers and for the students, that it's not about wanting children to sit still. We want to provide safe, appropriate support, sensory support, so that children can stay awake and pay attention and not be distracting. I'll stop there. I could go on and on, but I'll stop there.
That's
That's great. And we wanted to keep this informal. I'm reading some comments on the side, no questions, but please feel free to ask questions during this presentation. The next part I wanted to move into is, yes, Brian, go ahead.
Can I ask Kathy a question real quick about that space?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
In the idea of the educational commissioning and everything, and going through this process, were you able to get student input on what they did and maybe didn't like on this space, and what was a little bit of that, if you wouldn't mind sharing quickly?
What you can't see in this picture is an area that was taller.
Mm-hmm.
And Zoe and I talk about this all the time. Taller spaces, whether it's standing or in some sort of a lab stool or perching on a stool, some aspect of being up and above was very important. And in multiple schools that I've been in, especially after the fact, I'm always asking the children, why did you choose the space that you're in? A little boy was at the front of the class at a side-by-side table, and it was 7th grade. And in my mind, no 7th grade boy ever wants to be, I call it the front of the class. It was not arranged, in a linear way, but close to where the teachers spent a lot of time. Oh, I love it here. Look at all this space. I have all this stuff to do. And all the girls were in the back, up high. And I went, oh, I know those girls. That would have been me. I would have been that person. And in this space, some of the kids loved the couch. They just thought that was the bee's knees. They wanted to be on it. They wanted to lay on it. They wanted to lay over it. And other kids really wanted to be up high and kind of apart, have a little space around them. I think they were okay with the bean bags and I'll call them I call them almost like the pod chairs that are there that came, I think, from Kmart, she said. But they didn't like them because they were too hard to get in and out of. So there was all kinds of really interesting comments of, I liked getting in it, but then I didn't like getting out of it. They were okay with the floor table, but they didn't find those little discs to be comfortable. They felt too turned and too hunched over. They wanted more support, when they were sitting on the floor. But there were, she said, probably always at any time, at least 3 or 4 kids that were on the floor. Very few kids were at the areas where you can see it looks like where we're standing, kind of those were some work tables where she was with stools. They didn't seem to like that. They either liked being up on the floor, but not as much, or on the couch. That was what they found to be the best. But up was the number one thing that they liked.
So I find that extremely interesting. I actually spent a small part of my career in zoo design. The predatory animals like to be up high too. You don't like to be high level. So I don't know what that says about our human nature. Maybe doctors will comment on that. But anyway, so what I'd like to, so early on, the tactile colors, the furniture, and how the space is going to be used in a very important conversation, as we can see from this photo that we're leaving up. If left to the teachers, who are very resourceful and can be very creative, they might make the attempt, but it doesn't always hit the mark, right? So there's leadership involved here that needs to happen. And, good and bad, teachers want to personalize their instructional space for their students. They don't always recognize how much that over zealousness can impact their students in those rooms. And great that they have ownership. In fact, I find in most school districts that is the one thing that's hard to tether back. If someone is intent on tacking stuff all over the walls, that's a little bit hard to relearn for them. So this is all real important in the whole feeling of the space and the feeling that students have when they cross that threshold. So I would like our group to talk about, how does a district make sure, or how does a effort happen to make sure that enough allowance, even though we know it doesn't take a lot of money, but that is not a part of the budget that is forgotten in a project. So Brian or Suzanne, you guys want to kick that off a little bit?
Looks like Brian's waving to me. You know, I have some clients that will often say, you know, we need to evaluate furniture. We design a lot of spaces and we start thinking about the furniture that's going to go into the space and how to make it work. And really we have the conversation about how if we pick the wrong furniture in the end, the space isn't going to function the way that you want to. Right now, we talk a lot about things being flexible and movable, but if we put the same old desks and chairs in there, it's not going to function the way that we'd planned. And so I found that one of the ways, you know, to make sure that we're keeping a line item budget for the proper furniture is to always hint about the importance of getting the right furniture into the space. I've done exercises where we've, you know, taken a large room, brought in multiple furniture vendors and let them set up different types of furniture and brought in a bunch of teachers that were selected to be the ones to help choose the furniture. And it was, you know, like a trade show of just furniture and of a private group. And, you know, really get feedback about what they think their students need and how they would use it in a classroom. And once you get the teachers to buy into what they're gonna, you know, order, it's really hard to tell them later that they're not gonna get it if the budget disappears. And so, you know, there's little things that you can do. If you get the teachers involved early, if you get students involved to get buy-in, it's really hard to not have it be there on the first day of school.
Okay, thank you. Brian?
Suzanne, yeah, I think you definitely hit a lot there of getting the involvement of teachers is key. One of the things that we do over at Meteor and is sort of where I get to come in is being an educator. We come in and ask questions from the instructional side, as the architects were hitting on early too, and saying, what is the instructional practices that you're looking at? Building that vision, very much what was shared in the first session of what are the instructional expectations, what is the student learning experience going to be like, and starting from that point helps lend itself to having the conversation around what kind of budget needs to be there. So I know, Suzanne, you were saying how you've been fighting to get in and clawing to get in, and I'm right there with you with our designers coming in, trying to have those conversations early and bring an educational, you know, an experiential educational lens in that. And I see John has pilot
Yeah.
in the chat. It's huge.
It's big. Yeah.
If you can do that, a couple of classrooms where you get feedback from teachers and students and even parents, if they're able to get in there, makes all the difference in the world. And when it's built around that vision with the flexibility to change things at the end before you do a final rollout, that's key. We're doing one right now where we had 7 models. 4 of them needed minimal change. 2 of them needed a couple of pieces switched out, and 1 of them needed to be blown up and started over. And you know what? That saves hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? And a lot of teachers and a lot of union complaints and all of those things that can come when you have a rollout that becomes bumpy. So it's definitely important to really hit on and bring those stakeholders, I think, to include that budget. Because if there's people there talking about their needs, you're to keep that budget in mind. So,
and I think to address one of the comments that came in from Anna, you know, well, the comment from John about pilot, yes, I've done a lot of test classrooms over the years to get, you know, feedback from students. On the project where I had the showcase of furniture, we were replacing furniture as a modernization wave through the campus, and so we did purchased the furniture for the first portion and told the teachers that there was a budget on the side to add and personalize as needed. And then we use those first set of classrooms to let the other teachers come in. And you notice as we swept across the campus, the furniture order changed because people found value in pieces they didn't think they were going to find, you know, important, and things that they thought they really needed, they realized that they didn't. And so we were able to shift some of the stuff across the campus as we were purchasing, and then infill as we were ordering. And in the end, everyone, I think, was a little more excited about what they ended up with, because it allowed, you know, them to see, wow, we need more of these wobbly chairs because the kids are fighting over them. We need more of these stools. I need more places for kids to sit up higher. And I think until they started seeing that in the first wave and bringing their kids in, they didn't realize how important it was.
You know, I know when we've done projects, companies like Verco have been really willing to drop off samples, and having the samples paired with the training has been really critical, because teachers, you know, we really respect that teachers are nervous about disruption. They have a lot to manage, and when we start talking about chairs that move, they do think that their students are going to be rolling all over. I think Allison mentioned that a little bit, but you know, we found that when we provide training to the students and an acknowledgement that we know you need to move, everyone needs to move to stay awake, we're trying to give you a safe way to move that won't bother the other kids around you. When they understand that, and then the teachers understand that it's not that we're trying to get the children to stop moving, we're trying to give them a way to get the sensory experiences they need so they can pay attention, they start to have a different lens. And so we always ask the teachers to give us a couple weeks for things, for the novelty to die down. It never takes a couple weeks. After they try and they see the difference, we've never had teachers that want to go back to stable furniture. I think with the right kind of piloting has been mentioned and training, then we really can have a much higher success rate.
I think one of the other issues that comes up is the difference between modernization projects, where it's a district-wide program that generally has a very long lead up and often a very long tail as well, as opposed to a new school that's being built. One of the struggles I have when we're talking about when to get in and how early we can possibly get in, when you're talking, Susan, about clawing your way in, I often get, well, we're waiting till we hire a principal. And sometimes that's 6 months before the school's supposed to open. And I spent a lot of time in my children's schools volunteering and in the PTA. And one of the things that I always was cognizant of is when you let a principal, when you wait for that moment, although it's important because it's their space, to your point, Jenny, you know, everybody wants to customize and it's mine and I want it to be for me and only me. The other downside to that is it takes up a lot of back and forth. And on a new school, if you only have 6 months and they're hiring their staff, you know, they're doing all these other academic administrative chores, as well as trying to figure out the pilot classroom furniture, the teacher feedback. Everybody has an opinion. So like you were saying, corralling that information in an organized manner and having as much time as physically possible to include as many people as you can makes it feel less chaotic.
I also, I'm going to have to jump in. This has been a great conversation, and thank each and every one of you. We need to wrap up. We are all running late here, but it is about the individual. Make sure you test stuff out and you don't just, hey, that's a great idea, throw stuff in. It's trial and error. And that's why I do think, and we have this in the chat, that the research with CSRFI is so important, because, you know, we can fall back to that. We can say, here, look at this. These are studies that are done. So thank you very much. Look forward to the rest of the presentation, and we'll sign off now. Thank you.
Hey, Sam, move the slide one more. All right, let's go to the next slide then. Great. All right, next up, let's have Dwayne Mears come up. He's a CASH board member and works with PlaceWorks. Also, we've got Tova Korman. She's a CASH board member as well, and Director of Facilities at San Marcos Unified School District. Unfortunately, Tom Pace is not going to be with us today. He wasn't able to attend, but we do have Kurt Hunker, New School of Architecture and Design, and Rick Davey of Davey Architecture. So come on up, guys and lady.
All right, Julie, thank you. This is Dwayne Mears. Again,
a CASH board member and principal of PlaceWorks. We're an environmental planning and design firm. And I'm pleased to be joined by one district facilities director and 2 architects to discuss how we can support students' social and emotional well-being through design. And you've introduced our members here. If you go to the next slide. I hope my insights aren't too far afield for this. When Tom kind of tapped me for this, I was a little bit hesitant. But I think this is related to it and kind of goes against some of the things that we're trying to do. Some of our regulations and policies in California kind of, in my opinion, may work against us in the effort to make schools a strong, connected part of the community. And so that's what I've kind of listed here. Those things that I see that kind of work against us a bit. I'll talk a little bit about Title V, California Code of Regulations, CEQA and the way that we mitigate impacts. CEQA is an open public process and that can work against us sometimes. We've got NIMBYs that may be working against us. I see property acquisition as kind of working against us sometimes. When you think about how big a school needs to be in terms of the property or for a new school or maybe for expansion, we sometimes kind of jump out in a leapfrog development way and find properties that will work for us. But it's not always what we want in terms of the school being part of the community and very much integrated into it. Another issue I wanted to mention is just security fencing, which limits access to the campus after school. And I see that as a bit of an issue as well. If you go to the next slide. I listed these factors, these various risk factors that we have to look at. And the thing to notice here is the distances involved. In other words, many of the things that we deal with in terms of risk, we fix, we solve, we make safe through distance, which also means separation. And so it's in terms of railroads and power lines and all of these different things, freeways and roadways. I mean, these are important issues, but again, it's our regulations in California that also are keeping us kind of apart. And not necessarily supportive of social and economic emotional goals that we're looking for here. Next slide. CEQA mitigation, it also kind of works against us. I mean, so many different things we mitigate through distance, through buffers, through separation. And I've listed these, sensitive biological habitats. We protect views because of our neighbors, and that has a tendency to separate us from our schools. We always have neighbors and NIMBYs who, they all want good schools, but they might want them in somebody else's neighborhood and not next to them. And all of this is kind of despite the fact that the state of California has been encouraging infill development for quite a while now, but it's a difficult thing because we have kind of contrasting regulations in terms of CEQA and Title V and other things. And even though we've tried to streamline things, we still have a very litigious society, and that kind of works against us as well. Next slide. So the CEQA process is very public. It's an open, transparent process, but it also is subject to abuse by opposition. There are no easy projects anymore, even kind of modern, minor improvements to a campus, and we get pushback. And we get opposition, we get lawsuits. It's pretty incredible how all of this is kind of working against us. And what I see is that, it can be easier to find an isolated site rather than fight for a supportive site that's kind of within the community. We want these neighborhood schools, we want them to be inviting, and we want connections, and yet very often it's very difficult to do that. In terms of perimeter fencing, I'm very concerned about that as well. We see a lot of public pushback because people want to be able to access their campuses after school and on the weekends, but yet we have real security issues there too. And so I understand kind of the difficult issues there. Next slide. Okay, so despite these challenges, you know, we have districts on board here and architects that are creating engaging and supportive facilities. So there are successes that we can highlight. And so with this slide, I want to turn it over to Tova to talk about her experience.
Hi, everybody. I'm assuming you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm Tova. I'm the Executive Director of Facilities, Planning and Construction at San Marcos Unified. Today I'm going to talk about a couple things that I think are really important because social emotional health and safety and security is kind of like free and reduced lunch, right? You can't expect the student to feel, to be able to focus and study and learn if they're starving, because it's the only thing. So what social emotional kind of design is making sure you're taking care of every single child. Not everybody has a good home life. Not everybody has food. Not everybody has money. Some people have abusive parents, abusive siblings, and you know, kids need a school to feel safe and warm and what I call a big hug, right? So when they come to school, they know, number one, they will be fed if they need to be fed, and they are loved, because this school is a reflection of how much people and adults care about them. And the school is filled with people, teachers and staff members that truly, truly care about them. So in some cases, these schools become the only place of like peace for these children. So what I want to go through is some of the design things that we think about when we go through trying to build new spaces for children. So this is La Mirada Academy. This was the oldest school. It was 65 years old. That was rebuilt, and it's in a really poor community. And what we wanted to do is, you know, make the main entrance, you know, because they have to be two-story buildings because we have small school sites in some cases. So we wanted to make sure that the front entry kind of scaled down the entry. So you have this big building, and right in the center, there's a little hug for you to come in, open the doors, and you walk in and you see this beautiful, like colorful greens and blues and warm and inviting big open space in order to welcome you into the school. Next slide, please. So San Marcos High School is an example that Dr. Duffy brought up. This school was built a year prior to me coming to the school, and it is phenomenal. I've probably given more tours to that school than anywhere else. The goal of San Marcos High School was really to make kids feel that they can become anything they want, whether it's career ready when they leave school or college ready when they leave school. I mean, this campus really does look like a college campus. It tells these older kids that they are important and they're part of the community and they need to participate. The high school itself has such a wonderful, inviting all these different programs that help support all the different needs of kids. So we have, you know, visual and performing arts, where we have thousands of kids, like 2,000 kids in visual and performing arts. We have, you know, CTE courses and wood shop for those who want to take a different route or do both. And it really produces a sense of home, and that this is somewhere they can go, be appreciated and be supported by the staff, and that they're very well cared for. Next slide, please. So San Marcos Middle School is also a very old school. We had the opportunity to do replace 24 portables and build a new building, and then add another addition onto a gym that didn't have any locker rooms. And this school is very old. And what we wanted to do is, you know, this is the school that nobody wants to go to. It was the school that nobody wants to go to. And it was kind of, you know, this is a direct feeder school. The elementary school that feeds into this is brand new as well. It's just 10 years old. And then we had this kind of dilapidated school. So what we did is we invested money in revamping the entire school and entry to make people feel good. And also we connected the architecture so that the wood planks is a fiber force Trex material that is also on the high school. So we really wanted to connect the two schools and say, do well here and you will go to that big, beautiful high school. You will be on that path to college or career readiness. And the first day we opened this, the custodian came up to me after and he said, Tova, I've worked here for 30 years and I've never seen anybody take pictures on the first day of school. And there was more people taking pictures because they were so prideful of this school. And these are transition kids. So they're coming from elementary to middle school before high school. And this is a warm welcome to their school. And this canopy also provides shade that they never had for pickup and drop off and seats for them to sit. So it's a really warming environment. Next slide, please. So elementary school libraries. So, you know, classrooms are classrooms. They're all pretty much the same. You have special ed, you have science, and you have standard classroom. And, you know, you can put a beautiful color in there, accent wall, which we tend to pick very nice colors depending on the grade level. But these collaboration spaces, like a library, really need to be places that are fun and warm and allow kids to, you know, feel like they're special, you know. And this classroom, you know, we have, or this teaching space, which is a library, has movable furniture. It has wonderful carpet designs that shrink into the little nook for the little kids so they can kind of feel like when they're getting read to by the librarian that they're comforted in their little circle. And it's really just a fun space for them to like dream and imagine. So we really want to make sure that these spaces support these children in, you know, not thinking about situations that they might have going on at home. Next slide, please. So collaboration space. This is a project in design. We are rebuilding our now oldest elementary school, which is over 60 years old. And it's 27 portables out of 43 existing classrooms. So what we wanted to do, in addition to wonderful outdoor spaces that we created, we wanted to create collaboration spaces that are really fun and really kind of engaging. So this one will be built in about a year. But this really kind of, the circular design makes you, when you, in my opinion, would make you feel, you know, again, like a big hug, where you're getting direct instruction from your teacher, and then you can get up and interact. And again, the furniture does make a difference, and the carpeting as well. And so this is really, and aside from just the standard classroom, as you can kind of see on the left, there's you know, a hallway with regular ceilings. So this is the space for you to feel special, to feel like you can dream and you can actually, you know, work with other kids and your teachers and really have fun, because a lot of times social emotionally kids don't have that much fun, and they may not have as much fun at home, or they may not feel connected, whether they have a perfect home life or not. They may just not feel connected, and these types of spaces really kind of can help kids feel connected, which helps their social emotional health. And then the last slide, please, for me. Okay, so this is an interesting thought. So I couldn't get a picture, so I decided to do the floor plan. So this is a SEAS room, which stands for Social Emotional Academic Success. And that's a program for children who struggle emotionally and socially, and really, it's a special ed type class that could be very severe in nature, where children will act out in some cases and hurt themselves, or defecate, or, you know, leave the school and run into the street. And so what we did here, this is for K-8, we took 2 standard classrooms, and if you split it down the middle, you'd see how that creates 2 separate classrooms. So because it's a K-8, we wanted to have 2 rooms for these SEAS children. And these are kids that are in standard classrooms during the day and then are pulled out when necessary. So there can be anywhere from like 5 to 9 people in each of these classrooms at a time. And so what the idea, working with the SPED director and the teachers, is really they need to be smaller spaces, and they need to be smaller spaces because they need to feel comforted and also directionally focused. So there's not too much to look at, and there's not too much space for them to run all over, and the supervision is higher. And so in the center, so on the left is the younger kids and on the right is the older kids. And in the center there, we have a room. The room below is for either the psychologist who's part-time, the social worker who's part-time, and then also is a space where if a child needs to take a test or just needs to be alone, can be in there and sit at a desk or talk to the psychologist. But it's in the room because a child isn't going to feel safe when they're walking out of their classroom to see the psychologist or the social worker, because people will find out. This way, they're already in their protected space, and then they go into this room and feel like they have their privacy. And then on the top right is a restroom that we have with only a lock for the teacher in case they lock themselves in. But on the left of that room is a safe, calm room. And the safe, calm room is a place where kids go when they are hurting themselves. And unfortunately, this group is growing and growing throughout the district, but this safe, calm room has design features that I'll just briefly bring up. The floors are made of a resilient flooring, as though you would put it in a gym, like a Mondo type floor. So in case they hit themselves or their heads on the floor. The walls are padded with gym pads up to 8 feet. The ceiling from 8 feet and above is painted a very calm tone of blue, as well as the accent walls in this room. There's no bright colors. Everything is a calming color. There's no door frame, and there's no light switch, and there's no door. And the reason is because these children need to calm down, and they also need to not hurt themselves. And so the supervisor will be standing outside that open area with a pad and wait till they calm down. So I just wanted to bring up some of the things about design that, you know, the district is really focused on the social emotional health of children. So that's all for me. I'll stick around for questions.
Nova, thank you. Next slide, please. Let me turn it over to Rick Davey and Kurt Hunker.
Well, after over 2 hours of seeing all the right moves and what you should do, this is the entrance, or maybe not, to a rural high school here in San Diego County. The sign to the left on the wall there says high school office in it, and it points towards that door. The sign on the door says all visitors please report to the main office. We've just started a modernization at this school, but not surprisingly, 3 years ago in a small school of just 400 students, there were 37 out-of-school suspensions that year, mostly for fighting. The fellow who's now the superintendent and our client, as we embark on this whole site modernization, said, Rick, whatever you do, please fix this entrance, make it more inviting, make it warmer, make it more welcoming, because that's what we're doing now, actually. We have somebody posted in the office around the corner, they welcome people in, and we don't have many fights anymore. Well, Patrick, we haven't done any architecture yet. I'm going to be the heretic in the crowd, by the way, today. We haven't made any of the right moves yet. How were you able to do that? He says, well, I hired a firm called Mending Matters, which is a group of psychologists and mental health professionals using, and this will make sense to Tom, using Title I funds paid for a full-time school psychologist on site. And we managed to make it a much, much safer place to come to school. Because we all know if you don't feel safe, you can't learn. So that's the first step. Now, we'll turn this over to Kurt, and he'll show you a couple of examples of what we are trying to do in the right direction. Kurt.
All right, thanks, Rick. And hi, everybody. Kurt Hunker here, and I've been an architect almost 40 years. I've been a teacher for over 30. I teach mostly grad students, which may explain my gray hair. My one connection to CASH is teaching a school design studio, and New School's been lucky enough over the years to have a number of winners in that competition, which is a great thing to do. I'm a big advocate for CASH and for outreach like that. So what I'd like to do, keeping mindful of the time here, is to just hit on a couple key points and show a handful of images. I think we have about a half dozen here that speak to issues revolving around social and emotional health and support, and the security issue as well. And we start with two images actually from San Bernardino. We had hoped Tom Pace would be here, and one of his schools. A makerspace, a project, kind of a hybrid program that is a series of pavilions around outdoor teaching areas. We think, as you've heard in some of the fantastic discussions this morning, from the research about the importance of kids being outside, access to nature, access to views of nature, fresh air, and so forth. That's support for their emotional well-being, and we try every opportunity we get to plan those into our projects. Next, please. And in terms of that issue of school pride and feeling good about where you go, another view from San Bernardino. This school is extremely proud of its history. They're the Cardinals. They have a small sort of a display room where trophies and artifacts are kept on exhibit, and that really became a key theme for us in designing the makerspace and creating this walk we call Cardinal Way. 10-foot letters in cardinal red, of course, the logo off picture here, all to support this sense of school pride that is so important to these kids, many of them disadvantaged, feeling really good about going to school every day. Next, please. Emerson School is in a very diverse, tough neighborhood, gang neighborhood in San Diego, near downtown. One of the things that we're doing that has been encouraging to the district is employing color and pattern to give a sense of belonging. You architects in the crowd, new facilities people all know color can be a pretty inexpensive way to make change in schools. We're a promoter of it. Pattern as well. We like multi-sensory environments, so we look for materials that offer the opportunity to touch them and to engage those senses beyond the visual. Next, please. At a school in North San Diego and Solana Beach, Skyline, a number of design ideas that I think this crowd has mentioned and is very supportive of. Windows where we can put them in with views to nature and views inside and out. The incorporation is as much glare-free natural daylight as we can bring into schools. A Skyline also was a school replacing an older facility on a long east-west street orientation. So we stretched the building form along that orientation for two reasons. One, we could incorporate north-facing clear stories into most of all of the classrooms. And secondly, that long wall of the school became the fence line, became the security line that Dwayne mentioned is becoming so problematic in many cases. We avoided a fence and gates as your first sort of introduction to the school. We think that's so important that when you arrive and when you enter, you feel comfortable, you feel like you're in a safe place, but it's not through 10-foot fences and all those other things that can be so unwelcoming. Next, please. At Emerson School, the clear story windows, graphics on the inside, patterns on the floor. there's a lot we can do. We talked earlier today about sometimes doing too much, but I think many things can happen to enliven these spaces and to make kids feel comfortable in them and feel like they belong and encourage learning along the way. Next, please. Skyline, a view out towards the patio. This is further emphasis of the judicious use of windows, views inside, views outside, where we can do that. We like to encourage that kind of thing. And I think one more slide, perhaps. Oh, there we are. I'll turn it back over to Dwayne. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank our panelists, Tova and Kurt and Rick. I appreciate it very much. I've been looking for any questions, and I don't see that in the chat box. We've had a few comments, but no questions. So with that, I'll turn it back to Julie.
Great job, guys. Great, and Tova too. Wow, I love your use of color.
Yeah.
Awesome. Just love that. In fact, to me, all our offices here, we've got orange walls, green walls, and blue walls inside our administration offices, and there was a pushback at first, but now everyone just feels, they don't see the color, they just feel good in the office.
If it doesn't feel fun, it may not be fun. And we think not only the design should be fun and enjoyed, we think the process of designing should be. We enjoy what we do, we enjoy the process, and hopefully you see the outcome when we're all finished.
Yeah.
All of us.
That's great. All right, next slide, Sam. So, and one more slide. So unfortunately, we are woefully out of time. We've run over so many great questions and talks. So in order to be respectful of everyone's time, we're going to need to hold the critiques and insights gained from today's panelists until the next CSFRI webinar, which is set for January 19th.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Hey,
yes.
Hey, Julie, can I I'll make it real brief, but I just had to say one thing as kind of the person that has, had this crazy idea way back, and I'm so impressed with where we're going. And, Tova Corman's comments were just really hit me hard, and she framed it so well. I just want to reiterate this, that, those feelings that we're after, and she uses the term, peace and love, right? And that kids feel a hug when they come to elementary school made sense to me. And she moved it then to secondary, where we need kids to feel pride and that they can become anything they want to in this world when they're done with school. And not that they don't need to feel hugs also, but that was just such a good description of what we want our kids to feel, right? And how do you measure that? And my point I want to make is, as we finish up today, is I think our constituents, I've seen examples, and our legislators and our government executives, they need something a little more measurable. And the feelings are important, but how do you measure what we know is true? That is the challenge of CSFRI, that we can put this in a concise, research-based, empirical method that that makes sense to people, lay people. So I want to thank everybody. This was awesome, Julie. I look forward to the next one. Thanks for letting me finish up with that.
Great, Don. I appreciate your comments so much, and you're spot on. So again, big thanks to all of our panelists today. Awesome, awesome job. What great questions as well in the chat boxes and comments. I really appreciated that. So also thanks to Sam and Caitlin, who are whizzes behind our webinar. So thank you all for getting this set up and herding our all the cats that we have to do to get a PowerPoint presentation together. So with that, all of us at CASH and CSFRI today wish all of you happy holidays and best wishes for continued good health. And of course, always gratitude to our essential workers and frontline heroes out there. CASH organization wants to be here to help and be a resource. We're going to continue to keep you informed through webinars, web shops, emails, whatever it takes, you're going to get the info. So thank you all for joining us, and happy holidays, everybody. Take care. See you in January.